Ahoy, adventurers! Your old buddy Hambone is here with another coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight. This month, the coupon code is Vintage, and it's good for $5 off an order of $25 or more, either in-store or online. And this code is good through August the 9th. So that's $5 off orders of $25 or more. Now is a great time to think about getting some curbside pickup if you're local to Noble Knight, or if you're sitting home looking for something new and fun, or maybe something old to complete your collection. There's never been a better time than now to buy games. So make sure when you're checking out at Noble Knight Games, you use the code VINTAGE to get $5 off an order of $25 or more now through August the 9th. Stay safe out there, and may the dice always roll in your favor.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He once told me the old security guard to the tunnel was Vin Diesel, Stu Horvath.
I see what you did there. That was good.
It's not easy to do these jokes after so many episodes, but we're working on it every day.
So as of when we're recording right now, with the Petty Gods episode just dropped, and people really appreciated your Tom Petty joke at the beginning of that one.
Oh, thanks, man. It's good to know that they occasionally land. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
How you doing today, Stu?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
So, Stu, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about Tunnels and Trolls.
Yet another game where they take the and they put a name on the front and a name on the back, and it's an RPG for everybody.
I love it. On the one hand, it's like a no-brainer. Like, can't you be a little bit more creative? But on the other hand, like, so many people have done it at this point that, like, I kind of love it. It's like, how many more things can we pair together that share the same first letter?
Yeah, right? My gosh. So what is it about Tunnels and Trolls that brought it to the table today, Stu?
So Tunnels and Trolls is one of many games that is sort of like a glaring absence in my experience. And I recently got a copy of the 5th edition box set, which came out in 1979.
Wow.
So it came out in 1979. They had 5 editions by 1979. It's crazy.
Whoa, wait. Hold on a second. So in the time where D&D kind of did Dungeons and Dragons and started like eyeing up advanced Dungeons and Dragons, this game, Tunnels and Trolls, had 5 editions.
Yeah. So these are actually printing editions. Like D&D screwed everything up by calling each version of their game an edition, like first edition, second edition, third edition. Like they're not actually editions in the book publishing sense. These are editions in the book publishing sense. But this is still super interesting. So Tunnels and Trolls was created by Ken St. Andre, who I've long loved because of his work on the Stormbringer Chaosium game, which I don't think we've covered, and we really should. That's a glaring oversight on our point. Anyway, Ken St. Andre, I think he was a librarian, and he gets a hold of the original Dungeons & Dragons box set, and he's like, wow, this is really cool, except like you need specialty dice, and the rules are really complicated. So basically in 1975, he writes his own D&D. And you recognize a lot of Dungeons & Dragons in it. But the thing about it is that it's simple. You could read this rule book and know it inside and out in a couple hours. For somebody like me, like I read the rules and I was just like, I get this. It was like 15 minutes of my time. I was like, this is a super simple, stripped down version of Dungeons & Dragons. His first version of it comes out in 1975. It's self-published. He gets picked up by Flying Buffalo later, I think a couple months later. That's the second edition. There's no actual real change in the rule set. The first substantial revision that happens in the game is in 77 with the 4th edition, and then the 5th edition hits in 79. And that's basically the edition that goes forward. It has many print editions, but as like a game system edition, 5th is sort of like the one that lasts the longest. I think it's replaced in 2005 or 6 by like a 5.5 edition. I don't think there is a 6th edition, and then there's a 7th and an 8th. The 8th is only in French, and it gets all weird and screwy. So it's still around. But yeah, in 1979, Tunnels and Trolls hits its classic level and kind of stays there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it stays there for like decades.
Yeah, and it has like this crazy longevity because it's an awesome system. Now, the thing that I think that's so interesting about this is that we think of stripped down OSR projects as a modern phenomenon that kind of came about in, 2001, 2002, and has sort of snowballed into a large creative movement in recent years. But I think that Tunnels and Trolls, and to a lesser extent the Arduin books, really show how early this was happening. And like this has been with us from the very beginning. And I think Tunnels and Trolls is even more interesting because St. Andre was actively trying to simplify it because he felt the complexity of vanilla Dungeons and Dragons was too great a barrier to entry for players. And I think that that's a super modern sensibility. This is the earliest hack of D&D. He basically gets the white box and he's just like, well, I'm going to fix this, And I find that mind-blowing.
I mean, to come in hot on the heels of the white box and already be hacking it. I mean, we are in 2020 excited about things like OSE. Now you're getting in your Wayback Machine, and St. Andre is like, yeah, there's a huge barrier to entry to the original Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to fix that. I'm going to make it really simple. In 1979, that's crazy.
Yeah. I don't know how much Gavin Norman is thinking about Tunnels and Trolls when he's working on old school essentials, but the impulse has been there since almost the very beginning. And I think that Chris McDowell's Into the Odd system, which is super minimal, even to an extent, Luca Regic's CCAT system, very much this idea of just taking like all of the fine grain, realistic, quote unquote, details out and just like making it so stripped down. I think that all of it comes directly out of Tunnels and Trolls, or at least Tunnels and Trolls was the first folks to do it and planted that flag saying you could do this. A couple other things that they do that are kind of groundbreaking. So they didn't limit themselves to just doing scenarios like a GM versus player thing. They had a huge line of solo adventures. And in fact, when I think of Tunnels and Trolls, I generally think of the solo adventures. I have seen them in the past. And they are the first adventure game books because they came out so early. They beat everybody else to the punch. Choose Your Own Adventure is like a narrative game book, right? When I say like an adventure game book, I mean one that requires you to roll dice. So out of this, they beat Fighting Fantasy, they beat Joe Dever's Lone Wolf books, all of these beloved adventure game books. Tunnels and Trolls was the first system that was putting these things out. All of that comes directly out of Tunnels and Trolls, which is mind-blowing too.
So, simplifying it, does that mean there's less dice to roll?
It does. It's a D6 based system. One of the things that bothered St. Andre was the fact that like you needed these weird ass dice. In the 70s, there was a dice shortage too, so you couldn't get these weird ass dice easily. That's when you started seeing like the cardboard dice chits in the basic box and stuff. So his thing was just like everybody's got 6-sided dice kicking around the house. Let's use those.
Well, yeah, because I mean, you would just go and crack open any board game you had outside of like Ouija. You would have a 6-sided die lying around the house, or maybe, your dad shoots craps. I don't know. We're not judging here. However, it's not like, my dad who like taught me and all my friends at my 10th birthday party and how to shoot craps, and I digress. So you would have a dice lying around the house, and you could play with that dice. Now, listen, don't get me wrong. I love polyhedral dice. However, I can imagine in 1979, you might find dice a little harder to come by. Like, you can't just, oh, you know what? I want a new set of dice. Game stores closed. Well, I'm just going to go and open up my Amazon app and order a pound of dice from Chessex. You know what I mean? Like, you just can't, oh, this Instagram, like, targeted ad. They know I like dice. Well, this company looks great. Oh, I'm going to order this cool color dice, and it's going to be here in, like, 2 weeks. Like, you didn't have that luxury back in the 70s. So I get it.
Yeah. And as longtime players, we're more comfortable with them, and we can glance at our dice and know which die we need, what an 8-sided die is, what a 12-sided die is. When my wife was playing Call of Cthulhu with us, and that's really just, a 100-sided die game, it was still a barrier to entry to just know and be comfortable with those dice. But everybody knows a 6-sided die.
I mean, that's one of those things. If you look at like flash tattoo art, if you look at like emojis, there are 6-sided dice. I mean, it's like a deck of playing cards. People know what a deck of playing cards is. They know what the 6-sided dice is. They don't necessarily maybe call it a 6-sided die, but they know, like, well, that's dice. Like, in most people's mind that don't play Dungeons and Dragons or anything with odd dice other than that's what dice are. Like, I remember telling my mom, like, what do you want for Christmas, Johnny? And I was like, oh, you want to get me like a pound of dice? And she's just like, oh, okay. Like, she didn't realize that they made dice in anything other than 6.
Yeah.
So I like that idea. I like the simplification of it. I know for me, as I get older, I like games that are less rule heavy and easier for the players to do things that are more cinematic and more adventurous and like crazy ideas to try to see if something's going to work instead of focusing on you need X amount of dice and these are the 19 pages of rules you need to memorize so your character can do two things. So I get it.
Totally. And the combat system, I think, is sort of emblematic of how Tunnels and Trolls sort of reduces the overhead for rules and stuff. So each weapon has a certain number of dice that you roll. So, like, your broadsword might be like 6 dice, right? And the monster's longsword might be 4 dice. So you both roll those dice pools and you compare them. And if you beat the other person, you do damage. The number of points damage that you do is the number that you beat that roll by. So if I roll a 15 and you roll a 12, I do 3 points of damage. If you have armor and it reduces your damage by 1, you take 2 points of damage. It's all in one roll and it's just easy and like super straightforward. You don't have to worry about positioning. You don't have to worry about encumbrance. It sort of makes a metaphor out of everything. All of the parrying and dancing around that you visualize in combat is just in one roll and you don't have to worry about it.
Right, just describe what you want to do, roll the dice, and let the dice roll as they may.
Yeah, and then a lot of the times this is a solo adventure, so you could narrate it to yourself. And another thing that I think that Tunnels and Trolls is underappreciated for is the amount of silly ass humor that's in it. There are pop culture references and like it's a funny game and funny in a whole bunch of different ways. Like there's silly funny, there's weird funny. There's a couple adventures by a fella who's nicknamed Bear about bear centaurs and werebears, and it's weird. There's some weird stuff going on, but it's very funny and it doesn't take itself very seriously as a game, and it's very lighthearted, which I think contrasts very nicely with D&D, which I always thought sort of took itself too seriously.
Now, do you think that the comedy might have been to his detriment, though? Because obviously people everywhere, I know it's a broad generalization, but when you think about RPGs, Dungeons & Dragons is the blue jeans of role-playing games. You don't ever hear anyone talking about Tunnels and Trolls.
You know, you don't, but you do, because it's still around there. It's definitely a bigger game in Europe, but I was looking through old reviews of the game, and everybody's sort of like, oh, this is fun, this is novel, but like it doesn't have enough tooth to it. And like people are going to play this for a little while and graduate to D&D, or people who are used to D&D aren't going to want to like lower the complexity and all of these things that people are saying about it, but they're wrong. And I think that Tunnels and Trolls has endured for decades. It's a super popular system for what it is. I mean, you can't ever measure anything against Dungeons and Dragons because it's just a behemoth. But not only did it last on its own, but I think that the idea of rules light and, stripped down play is alive and gaining steam right now. I think that Tunnels and Trolls was like hugely ahead of the curve and inspired people to take the scalpel to D&D in later decades.
So I think at this point, everyone's pretty used to the iconic style of Dungeons & Dragons art through the years. What's it like for Tunnels and Trolls?
Yeah, it's always the thing that I think is interesting. And there's this idea, I guess, that the iconic early Dungeons & Dragons art is iconic because of a combination of it being such a huge share of the marketplace plus nostalgia. And whenever I find an old game from those periods where I'm not familiar with it, it so reinforces to me that there's something interesting about that period's art that isn't nostalgia based, because there's so much good art in Tunnels and Trolls and I've never seen any of it before. And it's just so exciting to have like all of these books all of a sudden with new fantasy art of that early time. One of the key people who did art for Tunnels and Trolls was Liz Danforth. She actually also edited a lot of Tunnels and Trolls material. I know her best from her work on MERP. She did a lot of Middle-earth role-playing illustrations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she does a ton of Tunnels and Trolls, and it's cool because it's sort of like her earlier work. So it's a little looser, a little less experienced, let's say, but it's still totally identifiable as Liz Danforth. And it's just so much fun. I feel like the MERP stuff, there's restraints on what she could do because it's MERP, but like she gets to do like a lot of weird stuff in this, and it's just so good. She's one of the all-time greats of role-playing art, and she doesn't get nearly enough credit, I think. There is just a high quality of art in the Tunnels and Trolls books. I wasn't expecting that. I expected it to be more in line with like the crummy white box art.
Right.
And not the case. I wouldn't say overall they were on a professional level, but they were just shy. Like they had really high production quality at that point in, 79. It was like mid 80s before Chaosium got to, a decent level of professionalism. Like Flying Buffalo and Tunnels and Trolls did a really good job really early. And it's a shame that they're not more known and lauded for that.
Very cool, Stu. Do you have any final thoughts on Tunnels and Trolls?
My final thought is that 5th edition Tunnels and Trolls is so good and so interesting that I bet that later editions that are more recent that you could probably get for cheaper are definitely worth your time. Because, we're in a pandemic, and anything that supports solo play, that's a good thing.
That's where the money's at, man.
All of a sudden, like, there's all these people being like, oh, man, we should do some solo games. Like, Disciples of Bone and Shadow from Exalted Funeral was like the first new solo RPG that I had seen in forever. And then all of a sudden now I'm seeing tons of them. And it's like, oh, I wonder why.
And necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, but there's a ton of awesome Tunnels and Trolls solos out there for you already, so you should try and pick them up.
Very cool, Stu. So this was another awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. It's also our 2nd anniversary of the show.
Oh my God, we made it 2 years.
2 years doing this show. Now, the Instagram has been around longer. However, this show is 2 years old. And to celebrate, I built a merch store. So if you love Vintage RPG and you want to support the show, I know, you quit drinking and what do you do for fun? Well, I build merch stores now. Yeah. So you want to support the show, you can go on our website, vintagerpg.com. There'll be a little tab that says merch. It'll take you to our merch store. We've got some amazing t-shirts, mugs, bags. We've even got the Raglans, the baseball-style t-shirts on there as well. We got baseball hats that say Vintage RPG on them. The design was by the amazing Sally Canarino. She did a killer job reimagining the logo for Vintage RPG, so it's all there for you to buy. Oh, actually pretty cool too. I made very thin hoodies. So you got that nice, sweet t-shirt material style hoodie with the Vintage RPG logo on it, the skull and the books, because that's what we're all about, skulls and books.
The skulls and books, that's my entire house. It's built out of skulls and books.
It really is, and shelves that clearly take like a month or two to get delivered so you can get more skulls and books.
Yeah.
Stu, where can the people find you?
The people can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I constantly am posting things like Tunnels and Trolls and other vintage and modern role-playing games for your enjoyment.
Very cool. Stu, you can find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons & Dragons. I tweet about professional wrestling. You could also follow my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you want more Hambone in your life, check out My Tai Happy Hour. It's pop culture for weirdos wherever podcasts are found. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. Your reviews do help other listeners to find us. And folks, from my heart and from Stu, we just want to say thank you so much for 2 great years of doing this podcast. We love putting on a show for you every week, and we're so glad that it only took like a year to finally be able to put them out weekly, but it really does make us happy to talk to y'all about the games and the history of games and, what we're playing and, let everyone know that you're all not alone in the world, and we're happy to have you on board with us. And with that, definitely check out our Discord. You can find us posting links about that. We will talk to you about games, and our patrons will play them with us. So definitely check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg for bonus content, for early release episodes, some behind the scenes stuff, and more. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.